In this compilation, we dig back through the sands of time to bring you a selection of intriguing tales. Our first story is one that has tragic parallels that have played out across the world as we explore the trial of the Pittenweem witches. In 1704, a minister in a small fishing village along the Scottish coast came into possession of a pamphlet titled Seducimus Debellatus, written by Lord Francis Grant Cullen. The minister, a Presbyterian named Patrick Cowper, pored obsessively over Cullen's words, which described the 1697 witchcraft trials in Paisley. Cowper believed entirely in the existence of witches and was certain that exposing such creatures was essential to uncovering the devil's sinister work. The pamphlet described how the 11-year-old daughter of the Laird of Barrigan claimed to have been tormented by local witches in a plot led by the family servant Catherine Campbell. After witnessing Campbell steal milk and reporting the theft to her mother, Campbell cursed the girl. Shortly after, the girl became violently ill with fits and fevers. When even an esteemed Glasgow physician was unable to diagnose the child, a local minister concluded that she must be tormented by possession and witchcraft. In the throes of her misery, the young girl named 35 local men and women as witches. After an investigation and trial, 7 of the accused were convicted of witchcraft and condemned to death. They were hanged and then burned on Paisley's Gallow Green on June 10, 1697. Cowper believed fervently that the good people of Paisley had successfully saved themselves by destroying a coven of witches. He distributed copies of Cullen's pamphlet to his flock in Pittenweem, urging them to consider the danger lurking in their own village. So when he was called to the bedside of a young boy who was suffering from an unexplained illness, he was ready to root out the devil's handiwork in Pittenweem as they had in Paisley. What followed was one of the darkest witch trials in Scotland's history. By the early 18th century, Scotland had been hunting and persecuting witches for well over 100 years. Mary Queen of Scots passed legislation naming witchcraft a crime punishable by death in 1563, but her son, King James VI, ushered in a national obsession with hunting witches. In September 1589, James's new wife, Anne of Denmark, was set to sail to her new kingdom, but the journey was a disaster, with fierce storms forcing her to anchor in Norway twice for repairs. With winter setting in, Anne's voyage to Scotland was postponed until the spring. Impatient, James sailed to Norway himself to fetch his queen. Faced with accusations of improper shipbuilding and seafaring, the Danish Minister of Finance and the admiral responsible for rerouting Anne's voyage to Norway blamed the difficulties on a coven of Copenhagen witches. The men claimed the accused witches had called up the storms that had battered Anne's ship, and a dozen women were tried and convicted of witchcraft in Denmark. When James and Anne set sail for Edinburgh the following spring, their voyage was once again beset by brutal storms that made the crossing perilous. Once safely on Scottish soil, James set about unmasking the witches who'd attempted to kill him and his new wife by calling up the Tempests. A massive trial involving 70 accused witches followed, with an untold number sentenced to death. The Church, which had long desired an increased focus on witchcraft and demonic possession, jumped at the chance to pursue devil worshippers with a new fervour, sparking 150 years of witch hunting and persecution that would result in the deaths of at least 2,500 Scots. Directly across the Firth of Forth from New Berwick, where Agnes Sampson and dozens of others were accused of sending roiling storms to destroy the King and Queen's ship, the small seaside village of Pittenweem seemed an unlikely site for a witch trial. The area had existed as a fishing village since the early medieval times, with the oldest structure, St. Fillan's Cave, dating back to the 7th century. Pittenweem's sheltered beaches provided safe places for fishermen to draw their boats out of the water, creating a close-knit community that seemed protected from the tumult of the outside world. In March 1704, Beatrix Lang, the wife of a tailor and a treasurer of Pittenweem, paid a visit to the local smithy. Beatrix asked the smithy's 16-year-old son, Patrick Morton, to make her some nails. The boy refused, explaining that he was busy making nails for a merchant ship awaiting their order in the harbour. Frustrated, Beatrix muttered a curse at the boy and left. Soon after this entirely average interaction, Patrick Morton fell ill, eventually becoming too weak to stand or walk. He refused food. His breathing became laboured, and his body grew rigid and twisted. Fearful that the boy was soon to die, Morton's parents called for Reverend Cowper to attend the child. When Cowper saw the state of the boy's illness, he immediately decided that witches must be to blame. Morton had heard the Reverend speak about the witch trials in Paisley before, and now, held captive in Cowper's audience, he listened to the man describe the similarities between his illness and that of Christian Shaw, the 11-year-old girl who'd fallen ill in Paisley. Cowper pressed Morton to name the woman who had called upon the devil to inflict his ailment, and in May, after months of illness, Morton recalled his quarrel with Beatrix Lang. Morton told Cowper that Beatrix had threatened and cursed him, and that the following morning he'd seen a bucket filled with water and burning coal outside of the woman's home, which he believed was for use in a spell. Under further prompting from Cowper, Morton also accused 5 more local women of being Beatrix's accomplice: Isabel Adam, Nicholas Lawson, Lily Wallace, Janet Horsburgh, and Janet Cornfoot. Beatrix Lang and Janet Cornfoot both had a reputation for casting spells and using threats during quarrels. Beatrix had been brought before the Kirk Session in 1696 on accusations of charming, though it's unclear if she was ever formally charged. Nicholas Lawson, the wife of a local farmer, had been previously approached by townsfolk seeking advice about witchcraft, and Janet Horsburgh, the widow of a seaman and local magistrate, had been rumoured to practice witchcraft. All 6 women were immediately arrested and brought to the Pittenweem Tolbooth. There they were subjected to torture, including being kept awake for 5 days and nights and being constantly subjected to pricking and pinching from a group of drunk locals. When the women refused to admit their guilt, Cowper stepped in. The minister beat Janet Cornfoot with a walking stick until she confessed. Soon after, all of the accused except Lily Wallace and Janet Horsburgh admitted guilt, likely hoping that once they confessed, the torture that they'd been forced to endure would end. Beatrix Lang confessed to making spells using buckets of water and burning coals, as well as stabbing needles into wax models of Patrick Morton. She told Cowper she'd met the devil in the form of a black dog on Ceres Moor, where she bargained with him after offering up her daughter and 6-year-old granddaughter. Isabel Adam confessed to making a pact with the devil, copulating with him and allowing him to brand her with his mark. She claimed she'd worked with the other accused women to kill a local man, but their plot had failed when he awoke at their approach and made the sign of the cross. Her confession also implicated a 7th person, a local man named Thomas Brown, who was promptly arrested and brought to the Tolbooth, where he vehemently denied wrongdoing. On May the 29th, 1704, Isabel Adam, Janet Cornfoot and Beatrix Lang were interviewed by the Kirk Session, where they all reaffirmed their confessions and repeated the names of their co-conspirators. On June the 14th, Janet Horsburgh and Lily Wallace were examined by the session, but continued to insist they were innocent. Thomas Brown never had a chance to plead his case. He died in the Tolbooth of starvation. Cowper and the Kirk Session approached the Privy Council and asked permission to hold a trial for the women in Pittenweem, but the council ordered Sir James Stewart, the Lord Advocate, to arrange for the proceedings to take place in Edinburgh. The Earl of Rothes, who also served as Sheriff of Fife, was tasked with overseeing the women's transfer to Edinburgh. But when he arrived in Pittenweem, the Earl found the accused women in terrible condition, still bearing the marks of their beatings they'd suffered during their incarceration. Believing the confessions to be coerced, the Earl informed the Privy Council that Patrick Morton was a cheat and a liar whose false accusations had led to death and torture. Instead of bringing the accused witches to Edinburgh, the Earl suggested Morton himself be brought before the Privy Council. By this time, Patrick Morton had miraculously recovered from his mysterious illness and no longer displayed any symptoms of curses or possession. The cost of keeping so many women imprisoned was becoming too much for Pittenweem to bear. The Baileys reluctantly agreed to release everyone on bail except for Janet Cornfoot. As one final injustice, the women were required to pay the town officer £8 Scots, a sum so significant that many of the women had to sell their own linen death shrouds to cover. While her fellow accused were free to go, Janet Cornfoot remained locked in solitary confinement in the Pittenweem Tolbooth under the orders of Patrick Cowper. A pitying prison guard moved her to a cell with a window just low enough for her to slip through, and in January 1705, Janet escaped and fled to the village of Lookers, 8 miles north of Pittenweem. However, her freedom was short-lived. For a reward of £10, a Lookers minister had Janet returned to Pittenweem under armed guard on January the 30th. When word spread that the escaped witch was being held at the home of a local bailiff, an angry mob confronted Cowper and asked what would be done with the woman. The Reverend told the group to do as they pleased, which they took as an endorsement to convict and execute her themselves. A group of at least 10 townspeople forced their way into the house where Janet Cornfoot was being held and tied her up, beat her, and dragged her to the harbour by the ankles. There, they dangled her from a rope stretched between a ship's mast and the shore. It is possible that the mob meant to dunk Janet, a popular punishment of repeatedly nearly drowning the accused. Instead, the crowd threw stones at Janet as she swung back and forth about the water. When they were tired of that, the mob lowered Janet to the ground and beat her with stones and sticks, while someone fetched a heavy door to place on top of her. They piled stones atop the door until Janet was crushed to death. Then, for good measure, drove a horse-drawn cart across the body several times. The mob dragged Janet's corpse to the home of Nicholas Lawson, intending to inflict a similar punishment on the other accused witch. But after 3 hours of inflicting brutal torture, the group was weary and decided to leave further executions for another day. Janet Cornfoot was denied a Christian burial and instead deposited in a communal grave at the spot known as Witch's Corner. Thomas Brown had been buried in the same spot months before. Within weeks, pamphlets describing Janet Cornfoot's brutal murder were circulating, questioning the legitimacy of Patrick Morton's accusations and raising suspicions about Cowper's involvement in the entire ordeal. The Privy Council appointed a committee of 5 noblemen, including the Earl of Rothes, to investigate Janet's death. A list of suspects and witnesses was compiled, but the main perpetrators quickly fled the area. 4 males were ordered by the Privy Council to be held in custody until they could be transported to Edinburgh for trial. But Cowper defied the Council's orders and released them. Beatrix Lane, who had moved away for a time following her release from the Tolbooth, returned to Pittenweem in early 1705 and gave an account of the torture she'd endured while imprisoned awaiting trial. Fearful that the villagers might attack her, like they had Janet Cornfoot, Beatrix asked the Privy Council for protection. The Borough Council and local bailiff refused to comply with the request, claiming that since Beatrix could be attacked at night, there was no point in safeguarding her during the day. The Privy Council ordered that further investigations be made into Janet Cornfoot's death and assembled another committee to undertake the task. but the men appointed to the committee never met. In 1708, the Privy Council was abolished by the Parliament of Great Britain, and a new structure of circuit courts became responsible for handling all cases of witchcraft. Not only did this mean that no one was ever held accountable for Janet Cornfoot's death, but also that Patrick Cowper had another chance to put the so-called Pittenweem witches behind bars. In October 1708, Cowper and the minister from the nearby parish of Anstruther East, William Wadroper, charged Beatrix Lang and Nicholas Lawson with witchcraft again. A circuit court heard the case, and the women were cautioned. A year later, the two ministers filed new charges against the women, and they were rearrested. With a trial date set, no doubt Cowper was gleefully imagining printing his own pamphlet to describe his triumph over two witches so devilish they'd escaped prosecution twice before. But just before Beatrix and Nicholas were set to face the court, Queen Anne's General Pardon Act, following the 1708 Jacobite Rising, acquitted all people due to stand trial for crimes committed before April the 19th, 1709. Beatrix and Nicholas were finally permanently free. By this point, most of Pittenweem was eager to forget the hysteria that had divided the community. But one woman was determined to remind the village of its sins at least once more. Janet Horsburgh, who'd refused to confess during Cowper's crusade, filed legal charges against two of the bailies, William Bell and Robert Werner, for wrongful imprisonment. In October 1710, Bell admitted his wrongdoing, saying, "I am convinced of the rashness, illegality and unwarrantableness of our proceedings, having proceeded on idle stories." Janet Horsburgh was awarded financial compensation, but more importantly, proved with certainty that the Pittenweem witch trials were a hoax, fabricated by a sick teenage boy and a vengeful minister. The Witchcraft Act was not repealed in Scotland until 1736, but no mass executions for witchcraft were carried out after the Paisley trials. Did Patrick Cowper, in his eagerness to make a name for himself as a witch hunter, expose the entire endeavour as a farce? Perhaps. But by then, it was too late for those, like Janet Cornfoot, who had already been dragged from their homes, shackled in the dark and crushed under the weight of suspicion. The Pittenweem trials, like so many before them, revealed how easily fear could be weaponized, how a whisper could lead to an execution, and how justice, once distorted by superstition and ambition, could become evil itself. Even after the execution stopped, the echoes of the witch hunts linger in the soil, the records and the scars of a nation that once believed the devil walked among them. We next turn our sights to southern France and a creature that left a bloody trail across the countryside. Cryptids, creatures claimed to exist but never proven, have long been linked to unexplained deaths. When the Silver Bridge collapsed in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in 1967, killing 46 people, many blamed the Mothman, a mysterious flying beast with glowing red eyes. In 1959, 9 Russian hikers mysteriously died in the Ural Mountains in what has become known as the Dilatov Pass incident. Some cryptozoologists have suggested that a Yeti attack could explain the brutal injuries inflicted on the victims, including a skull fracture, missing eyes, and a twisted neck. And the Popelick monster, a half-man, half-goat creature that haunts a high railroad bridge in Kentucky, has been blamed for luring dozens of victims to their deaths. But of all the cryptids linked to tragedy, none have a death toll higher than the Beast of Gevaudan, a deadly monster that terrorized rural France between 1764 and 1767, killing as many as 200 people. The beast's reign of terror began in early June 1764, when a young peasant woman caring for her cattle spotted a creature tearing out of the forest, running straight at her. Later, the woman described this beast as being the size of a calf with an unusually broad chest, a huge mouth full of canine teeth and fiery eyes. The creature had a shaggy red mane with a dark stripe running down its spine. The peasant woman was saved from certain death by the herd's bulls, who rushed at the beast, scaring it back into the forest. Less than a month later, the beast claimed its first victim, a 14-year-old shepherd girl named Jean Boulet, whose mutilated body was found outside the village of Saint-Étienne-de-Loudun. For the next 3 years, the beast maimed, killed, and ate hundreds of people in rural southern France, sparking an international uproar. The beast's hunting grounds of Gevaudan is now known as Luzère, the least populated department in France. It's an isolated, rugged land of mountains, craggy volcanic rocks, and dense forests. The weather is notoriously miserable, with cold, long winters and wet summers. One pikeman dispatched from Normandy to hunt the beast wrote to his patron, "I beg you, sir, if you have not already left for the Gevaudan yourself, forget about it. This is an abominable country with terrible food. There is little arable land in the area, and most locals survived by raising cattle. Hundreds died each year of malnutrition or starvation, and hundreds more suffered from ricket and scrofula. The villages were impoverished. The peasants who eked out a living in this desolate landscape had more than enough to worry about long before a mysterious beast began ripping their loved ones apart." Until the 19th century, France was home to one of Europe's largest Eurasian wolf populations, as many as 20,000. In most rural areas, including Gevaudan, wolf attacks were a well-known public hazard. Parish registers recorded brutal attacks in plain language, like this one from the La Chapelle-Tecle in Saône-et-Loire in 1749. Marie, aged approximately 7 years, daughter of Jacques Prudent and his first wife, Tianette Maroyer, was snatched from her doorway by a wolf and devoured in a field. Only her head, one arm, and her stomach were found, and nothing besides. These pitiful remains were buried in the cemetery of this church the following day, 5th of October, before my entire parish, who had gathered for the Sunday Mass. The population of wolves and the danger they presented gave rise to folk tales like Little Red Riding Hood, and saw the peak of early modern belief in the werewolf or loup-garou. While all wolves posed a potential threat to humans, particularly lone children, none were more terrifying than a rabid wolf. Predatory wolves select their human victims like any other prey, looking for individuals they can easily overpower. But rabid wolves, ravaged by illness, strike indiscriminately, attacking any living being they encounter. A single rabid wolf can attack multiple victims in a single day and travel long distances undeterred by territory or fear. In January 1764, a single rabid wolf killed 43 victims before it was hunted down. But the Beast of Gevaudan was unlike anything the peasants of rural France had encountered before. By the end of 1764, there had been at least 29 more attacks that killed 21 and injured another 5. In August, a 15-year-old girl and a 16-year-old boy died within days of each other from similar attacks whilst working in fields. In September, a young shepherd boy disappeared near the village of Laval. His partially eaten remains were found in the hills. Days later, a 36-year-old woman was killed on her doorstep. Survivors described the beast as much larger than a wolf, with red or grey fur, a stripe down its back, and massive razor-sharp teeth and claws. In October, hours after another mauling, the beast was seen at Château de la Baume, stalking a herdsman. A group of hunters followed the animal in the estate's woods and chased it into a clearing. The hunters struck the beast with a volley of musket fire, but after a brief fall, the beast rose to its feet and fled. That autumn, the Courrier d'Avignon began publishing sensationalized stories of the attacks. As news of the spate of attacks spread, outsiders blamed the rural peasants, arguing that the assaults were a result of their Protestant faith. In their view, the people of Gevaudan were being punished for harbouring ill will toward the Catholic Church and the monarchy. One bishop even claimed that the beast was a manifestation of the wrath of God. Skeptics believed that primitive superstition had worked the peasants into a fervour, preventing them from seeing run-of-the-mill wolf attacks as anything but the work of a monster. Accounts of the attacks, however, are particularly savage. Human remains were often found badly mutilated, decapitated, or ripped to shreds. The beast attacked not just with its teeth, but with its claws, and its victims were primarily young women and children, compounding the villagers' grief. Despite many attempts to hunt the beast, locals were unable to kill it, and the attacks continued. In January 1765, 12-year-old Jacques Potefet came face to face with the beast while in a meadow with his herd of cattle and a group of other children. When the beast charged, Jacques directed his friends to stand their ground and raise their sharpened sticks. The children managed to scare the beast away, and Jacques' heroic efforts were rewarded by King Louis XV, who paid the boy 300 livres and promised to fund his education. The same month, the Courrier ran an article claiming that the attacks were from a ferocious beast of unknown type, coming from who knows where, who drank the victims' blood and ate their flesh, all while hunting parties had been foiled by the beast's agility and cunning. In another article, the paper claimed that bullets were unable to penetrate the beast's skin. Days later, the paper printed that the creature could leap incredible distances and vanish and reappear at will. As the Courrier's sensational reports were picked up by national outlets, the king was ridiculed for his failure to protect his own people. How embarrassing it was, the people said, that the beast had been driven back by a young boy with a stick, while the king's armoured troops and royal hunters milled about in Versailles. In response to the criticism, King Louis charged a dragoon captain named Jean-Baptiste Duhamel with tracking and killing the beast. Duhamel was a zealous hunter, but his strategies, like asking parents of recent attack victims to allow their children's remains to be unburied, to serve as a lure, and eventually using living children as bait, were unpopular with the locals, to say the least, and ultimately unsuccessful. A 4-day hunt involving 20,000 troops and volunteers failed to yield results. To save his honour, Duhamel began repeating claims that the beast had supernatural powers. He wrote that the beast had a breast as wide as a horse, a body as long as a leopard's, and fur that was red with a black stripe. He concluded, "You will undoubtedly think, like I do, that this is a monster, the father of which is a lion. What its mother was remains to be seen." In mid-February, Louis XV dispatched 2 professional wolf hunters from Normandy to replace Duhamel. Jean-Charles Donneval and his son, Jean-François, brought with them 8 bloodhounds trained for wolf hunting to scour the 2,000 square kilometres of Gevaudan. A day after the Donnevals' arrival, a carriage travelling in a remote area was attacked. Reports of the attack described a beast that stood on its hind legs, had a mouthful of foam, and used its tail to hit a footman in the face before jumping through the carriage, shattering its windows, and escaping into the woods. The beast was said to have such a foul odour that the carriage had to be burned and its ashes buried. Following the carriage attack, the king offered a reward of 6,000 livres to the person who slew the animal. Combined with rewards from other local authorities, the total prize for bringing down the Beast of Gevaudan was now over 10,000 livres. After 3 months, the Denevals had failed to shoot a single wolf. By then, the story of the Gevaudan attacks had reached an international audience. The locals, who had devoted countless hours to hunting the beast, were demoralized as the list of victims continued to grow. Parisians were tired of the sensational claims from a primitive region taking up valuable inches in their newspapers, and the king was being mocked in London tabloids for his inability to capture the culprit. Fed up with the criticism, in June 1765, Louis decided to send his personal gun-bearer and lieutenant of the hunt, François Antoine, to Gevaudan to slay the mysterious brute. Marie-Jeanne Vallée, a servant of a parish priest, was crossing the river Dège with her sister when the beast appeared. When the animal lunged at her, Marie-Jeanne managed to thrust a spear into its chest. The beast dropped to the water below, but quickly recovered and fled into the woods. When Antoine heard of the attack, he rushed to the scene and discovered the girl's spear was indeed covered in blood, but he failed to track the beast. Marie-Jeanne's bravery earned national acclaim, and she was nicknamed the Maid of Gevaudan. Even today, a statue of the girl stands in her honor in Ouvre, France. At the end of September, Antoine finally succeeded in killing a massive grey wolf. He wrote, "We declare by the present report signed from our hand, we never saw a big wolf that could be compared to this one. Hence, we believe this could be the fearsome beast that caused so much damage." Antoine arranged for his son to have the beast stuffed and taken to Versailles, where it was exhibited in the Queen's antechamber. Then he hunted down the beast's pack and slayed them all to ensure none of its offspring would continue the reign of terror in future years. When he returned to Paris in early November, Antoine was heralded as a hero and granted the 10,000 livres reward. For a while, it seemed that the Beast of Gevaudan had finally been destroyed. But on December the 2nd, 2 boys were attacked by an enormous wolf-like creature. Before the end of the year, a dozen more attacks had been reported. According to an account published by the Parisian Illustrated Review, the beast's behavior seemed to have changed. Before, the creature had been scared by cattle and often avoided hunting near herds. Now it showed no fear. Had the beast evolved into a more terrifying monster, or was this a different creature from the one before? Either way, the royal court showed no sympathy. As far as the king was concerned, the Beast of Gevaudan had been slain by François Antoine, and any further attacks were certainly just the work of normal predatory wolves. Left to their own devices, the people of Gevaudan launched their own mass hunting parties, using poison, traps, and dogs to try to take down the beast. By the spring of 1766, the attacks had grown more sporadic, and weeks would pass with no new deaths, luring the locals into a sense of false security before suddenly restarting with ferocious vigor. A sudden outbreak of attacks in 1767 prompted a local nobleman, the Marquis d'Apcher, to organize another hunt. On June the 17th, the beast killed 19-year-old Jean Bastide in the village of Les Biniers. Just as the men were beginning to think the nightmare would never end, a local hunter named Jean Chastel shot a wolf on the slopes of Montmouchet. The creature was said to weigh over 100 pounds, with an enormous head and membranes that extended over its eyes. The beast's body was brought to the chateau of the Marquis, where a surgeon named Dr. Boulanger conducted an autopsy. The remains were consistent with those of a large wolf or wolf dog, but the carcass was incomplete when it reached Boulanger. He noted that the beast had powerful jaws with sharp teeth, coarse reddish-brown fur, and yellow eyes. The animal's stomach was found to contain remains matching the description of Jean Bastide. When Boulanger was finished with his work, the beast was exhibited at the chateau for about 12 days to massive crowds. In August, Jean Chastel accompanied the beast to Versailles, expecting a lavish celebration like François Antoine had enjoyed. Instead, he was quickly dismissed, and the beast was ordered to be buried without fanfare. Jean Chastel's hunt ended the 3-year killing spree, but no one could agree on how many creatures were responsible for the attacks or what exactly the Beast of Gevaudan was. Many believed the area had been plagued by an influx of wolves, and the attacks were perpetrated by both predatory and rabid wolves. Because the response to the attacks had been so intense, it was reported that as many as 2,000 wolves were slaughtered during the hunt for the beast. Perhaps this culling of the population had been the solution to the rampage rather than the killing of a single big bad wolf. Modern scholars have suggested that as many as half a dozen killed wolves were presented as the beast during the frantic hunt, and a certain amount of trickery, including pushing bits of bone and clothing into the wolves' stomachs with a long stick after death, was employed. Those who believed the attacks of the Beast of Gevaudan were committed by a single creature remain divided about the species of the animal. Some have suggested that the wolf may have been a non-native variety, possibly an Italian or Apennine wolf. This subspecies is known for its grey pelt, which reddens in the summer with dark bands along the back. Italian wolves are known to have migrated to France in the early 1990s, but is it possible one or more crossed the mountains to France in the mid-18th century? It's also been theorized that the creature responsible for most attacks was simply a huge Eurasian wolf. Also known as the common wolf or the Old World grey wolf, this subspecies can vary significantly in size. On average, Eurasian wolves weigh 39 kilos or 86 pounds, but the largest specimens can weigh up to 79 kilos or 174 pounds. If the beast was anywhere near this size, it would have appeared to be at least twice as large as the wolves most locals were familiar with. To the local peasants, weak with malnutrition and disease, a large grey wolf may have seemed an impossibly enormous and fast foe. There have also been suggestions that the beast may not have been a wolf at all, but a hyena. Certainly hyenas fit many of the characteristics ascribed to the Beast of Gevaudan. They are wolf-like in build, but with larger skulls. Their pelts are coarse with a ridge of longer mane-like hair along their spine. They have powerful jaws and can kill prey with a single bite to the neck. Hyenas often dismember their kill and are known to be more aggressive than wolves. It's been proposed that a hyena may have escaped from a private zoo and ravaged the countryside in search of food. But the descriptions given by survivors most closely match those of the striped hyena subspecies, which are primarily scavengers and rarely attack humans. Karl-Heinz Torke, a biologist and author of the Gevaudan tragedy, The Disastrous Campaign of a Deported Beast, has argued strongly for another possibility. Torke believes that the Beast of Gevaudan was an escaped exotic animal, but not a hyena. He thinks the beast was an immature male lion. Not only does a young male lion match many of the descriptions given of the beast, but several specific details given by survivors that were dismissed as sensationalism, a tasseled tail, strength enough to carry a victim away with ease, and standing on back legs to attack with the claws also point to it being a lion. While lions were a well-known species, most people, particularly rural peasants, had only seen illustrations of lions as fully developed males with massive manes. Therefore, it would be unsurprising that none of the witnesses described the beast as being lion-like. Instead, they repeatedly said the beast was like a wolf, but different, unable to accurately describe exactly what made it non-canine. Talker believes that's because France has no native big cats. Therefore, there was no frame of reference for a large feline creature. If the beast were a lion, it would also explain some of the supernatural characteristics ascribed to it. The ability to leap large distances, the skin seemingly impenetrable to musket balls, and the fiercely strong jaws capable of crushing a victim's skull with a single bite. Displaying exotic animals like lions had become fashionable among the nobility in France, and King Louis himself had been gifted a lion cub as a child for his royal menagerie. According to historians, Louis XV neglected and ultimately abandoned his menagerie, so that by the time his successor took over, the animals were living almost freely in ruined buildings. If a lion did escape from a royal or nobleman's private collection, no one would be eager to admit it, especially when hundreds of peasants started dying in brutal attacks. The Beast of Gevaudan cemented the French view that the wolf was a danger that must be eradicated. Wolf hunting was not only permitted, but encouraged. As many as 6,000 wolves were killed each year until they had disappeared entirely by the 1930s. Migrating wolves from other areas have slowly repopulated France, and today there are more than 1,000 wolves in the country. While conservationists celebrate, farmers have responded with anger, arguing for reduced protections for wolves. Even though wolf sightings are rare and rabies has been officially eradicated, farmers worry about the danger wolves pose. The fear of wolves seems to be embedded in the collective memory of rural France, tied to a time when the Beast of Gevaudan haunted the fields and forests, killing indiscriminately and savagely. Whether the beast was a wolf, hyena, lion, or some other creature matters little, for the terror it inflicted is nameless and immortal. Across the Channel, Victorian London also had its own mysterious phantom in the form of Spring-heeled Jack. In 1929, a frightful spate of dog poisonings terrorised the counties of Lancashire and Cheshire. In a few short weeks, dozens of dogs fell ill or died after ingesting food laced with strychnine, a highly toxic alkaloid usually used as a pesticide. In some cases, the dog owners received written threats in the days leading up to their pets' deaths. The bizarre missives warned owners to keep watch on your dog and your turn next. The warnings were signed with a name that had struck fear into the hearts of Brits for nearly 100 years: Spring-heeled Jack. While police ultimately concluded that the poisonings were the work of mischievous young boys, the incident was a reminder of the haunting presence of one of England's most notorious legends. In October 1837, a servant girl named Mary Stevens was walking to London's Lavender Hill when, on her way through Clapham Common, a strange figure leapt from a dark alley, trapped her within his arms, and scratched and clawed at her with hands that were cold and clammy as those of a corpse. The terrified young woman screamed, and as several local residents rushed to her aid, the attacker fled. Mary's account was eerily similar to two other incidents that had recently occurred in London. In one, a businessman returning home after dark was frightened by the sight of a man leaping with apparent ease over the high fencing around Barnes Cemetery. The businessman described the mysterious figure as a muscular man of devilish features, with large pointed ears and bulging glowing eyes. Shortly after, Polly Adams and two of her friends were attacked in front of the cemetery by a similar creature. Polly's friends ran as the figure tore at Polly's clothing and flesh with what she later described as ironclad fingers. With three similar attacks reported so close together, the press seized on a sensational story of a supernatural entity terrorizing Londoners. Papers dubbed the mysterious attacker the Park Ghost and, of course, Spring-Heeled Jack. During a public session in January 1838, Sir John Cowan, the Lord Mayor of London, presented an anonymous letter claiming an unmanly villain was frightening local women. Shortly after, letters began pouring in to the mayor about wicked pranks in which young women were left wounded and terrified. Gowan was sceptical of the superhuman feat the writers of these letters claimed the assailant was capable of, but assured citizens that every effort would be made to capture him. The following month, 18-year-old Jane Alsop answered the front door of her father's house in the East London village of Old Ford to a man who claimed to be a London policeman. The officer shouted for Jane to bring a light as he had caught Spring-Heeled Jack in the lane. Jane fetched a candle and ran after the man, who was dressed in a long, dark cloak. As she handed him the candle, the man threw off his cloak and began to spit blue and white flames from his mouth. He then grabbed Jane and clawed at her with sharp fingers. Jane's screams summoned her sister, who managed to drag Jane back to the safety of the house and bolt the door. The attacker knocked, but left after the sisters refused to open the door. Jane described the man as having a most hideous and frightful appearance with eyes that resembled red balls of fire. 8 days later, on February the 28th, another 18-year-old named Lucy Scales was attacked under similar circumstances. Lucy and her sister were returning from a visit to their brother in Limehouse around 8:30 p.m. when they noticed a man standing at the entrance of Green Dragon Alley wearing a long dark cloak. As they approached, the man leapt out in front of Lucy, vomiting a large quantity of blue flame directly into her face. Lucy was so shocked that she dropped to the ground and suffered from violent fits for several hours. A man named Thomas Milbank was arrested after boasting that he was Spring-Heeled Jack in a pub. Milbank was tried at Lambeth Street Court for the attack on Jane Alsop, and according to some accounts, evidence tied to Milbank had been recovered from the scene of the attack. But Jane insisted that her attacker could breathe fire, and as Milbank was unable to produce flames of his own, he was acquitted of the crime. The press coverage of the attacks on Jane Alsop and Lucy Scales made Spring-Heeled Jack an instant legend. Earlier reports of Jack included his ability to leap and bound great heights and distances with ease, a detail neither Jane nor Lucy mentioned. But these inconsistencies mattered little to superstitious Victorians who were eager to speculate over the identity of the assailant. Spring-Heeled Jack quickly became a generic term to describe all sorts of criminals who took their victims by surprise and evaded capture. His likeness was used in penny dreadfuls, plays and puppet shows across the country, and his name was used as a threat to poorly behaved children. Despite his newfound popularity, Spring-Heeled Jack withdrew to the shadows for a time, with fewer sightings reported until 1843, when he reappeared in a wave of incidents across the country. In each case, an unsuspecting citizen was surprised by a strange man who raked them with claw-like hands before escaping capture by leaping over hedges or walls. In 1872, Jack was spotted back in London after nearly a 3-decade absence. A woman and a small boy were attacked while walking in Carshalton on Saturday evening by what a witness called a most hideous sight. A passing man attempted to beat the figure with a stick, but it fled into the woods and could not be found. Numerous victims reported being attacked in Clapham Park and Clapham Common in late 1872, with one paper describing the events as follows. The practice of this lively young gentleman seems to be to dress himself in a short cloak and to proceed along some of the quieter suburban thoroughfares till he meets someone walking alone. He then comes to a sudden stand before his victim, throws open his cloak, and shows a breast and face illuminated with phosphorus. By means of springs attached to his feet, he leaps over the hedge or wall adjoining and disappears. This new torrent of attacks reportedly resulted in 2 deaths and the severe injury of a policeman from intense fright. Londoners were so disturbed at Jack's apparent return that large gangs of men were organized to patrol the streets at night in hopes of capturing the menace. According to one report, Jack himself sometimes joined in on these hunts for fun, once leaping over a group of searching policemen before bounding off into the darkness. Spring-Heeled Jack's favourite victims seemed to be young women and solitary wanderers, but in 1877 he chose an unlikely target, an army barracks housing as many as 10,000 soldiers. In the spring of that year, guards posted at the barracks reported seeing a tall man capable of leaping buildings in a single bound during their night watches. The behaviour of this strange figure quickly escalated into attacks when the leaping harasser began grabbing guards' faces from his perch atop their sentry boxes. Some guards attempted to fight back, but the attacker always managed to evade their frantic gunfire. Other victims were left frozen in fear. According to the account of one sentry, Jack's attack came after the sound of someone dragging something metallic down the road. The guard followed the noise to investigate, but found nothing. After returning to his post, Spring-Heeled Jack leapt at him, spitting blue flames into his face before jumping over the other sentries who ran to his aid. Later that same year, Spring-Heeled Jack was rumoured to be terrorising the rooftops of Newport, where locals opened fire. There were some reports of bullets striking Jack, but no one was ever able to slow him. Various sightings of Spring-Heeled Jack continued across England into the late 19th century, but his reign of terror was overshadowed by another villain, Jack the Ripper. When the mutilated bodies of women began appearing in Whitechapel in 1888, Spring-Heeled Jack's antics seemed positively childish by comparison. But he was so embedded in British law that some believed Jack the Ripper and Spring-Heeled Jack could be the same evil entity. Indeed, one of the letters received by the Metropolitan Police during the investigation was signed, Spring-Heeled Jack, the Whitechapel murderer. Spring-Heeled Jack's reign seemingly continued into the Edwardian era. In 1904, he was blamed when a series of pranks pestered the small village of St. Margaret. The Worcestershire Chronicle reported that the fear in the village is so intense that neither woman nor child will now go out after dark. Locals noted that the rogue was only ever seen by man at a distance, so a group of gallant hunters decided to trick Jack by dressing as women. One night, they chased the leaping figure across fields, but Jack vanished into thick fog just as they closed in on him. All the while Jack was terrorising St. Margaret's, he was also reported as being sighted in Kent, Blaenavon and Monmouthshire. In Everton, he was spotted on the steeple of St. Francis Xavier's Church in Salisbury Street. Witnesses claimed the man appeared to throw himself from the roof in an act of apparent suicide, but when they rushed forth to help, they discovered a helmeted man clothed in white waiting for them. The man ran toward the crowd before springing into the air and vanishing. In some reports, Jack was a ghost. In others, he was solidly a man. Sometimes he spat flames and sometimes he flashed wicked metal claws. He was seen wearing animal skins and billowing cloaks. He was spotted walking on all fours and leaping nimbly on springy toes. Spring-Heeled Jack was argued to be responsible for the terror of the Peckham ghost, the mystery of the devil's footprints in Devon, and the most famous string of murders London has ever known. Over time, he evolved in fiction into a vigilante, a sort of anti-hero who used his supernatural abilities to punish wrongdoers. How could a single entity embody so many different experiences? One theory is that the original Spring-Heeled Jack, who terrorized the London area in the late 1830s, was the young nobleman known as the Mad Marquis, Henry de la Poor Beresford, the third Marquis of Waterford. The Marquis was expelled from Oxford in early 1837 and marked his homecoming with a series of drunken brawls, vandalism and brutal pranks. His favourite target was women, whom he was well known to view with contempt. The Marquis was imposing, athletic, and an excellent horseman. He was also known to do anything on a bet. Beginning in 1840, some Brits named the Marquis as a suspect for the true identity of Spring-Heeled Jack, believing the roguish nobleman was terrorizing women at the behest of his callow entourage. Between the attacks on Jane Alsop and Lucy Scales, a servant boy in Turner Street claimed he opened the door to a cloaked Jack, who immediately revealed his demonic visage. The servant slammed the door, but not before noticing a letter W embroidered on the demon's cloak. Many believed this detail was part of the Waterford family crest, a shield with a large W on it. The Marquis married in 1842 and settled into a country estate where he reportedly lived a perfectly respectable life until he died in a riding accident in 1859. Were his juvenile antics repeated by copycat Spring-Heeled Jacks after he settled into married life? Other theories about Jack's true identity are rooted in the supernatural, including that he was a demon or a ghost, was summoned to various locations throughout history by members of the occult, or was manifested by periods of spiritual turmoil. In 1961, the London-based magazine Flying Saucer Review published an article by J. Viner titled The Mystery of Spring-Heeled Jack, in which the author presented the theory that Jack was an alien marooned on Earth accidentally. The sightings of him in the late 1830s were Jack's desperate attempts to locate a safe house, an ally, or his misplaced spacecraft. In Viner's view, Jack's incredible abilities resulted from alien technology that allowed him to defy gravity. As entertaining as these theories are, most academics agree that the most likely explanation for Spring-Heeled Jack is that he never really existed at all, but was created out of a sort of mass hysteria common with other urban legends. The dark, impoverished outskirts of Victorian London were rife with fear, and certainly some men took advantage of the environment to terrorize women. In a state of sheer terror, a sputtering lantern can morph into a vomit of flame, a sinister, groping hand may become a cutting claw, and a fleet-footed man can turn into a leaping demon. As the attacks proliferated, it's possible that victims experienced a form of hallucination that imprinted Spring-Heeled Jack's most notorious characteristics onto the actual situations, which may have varied to include everything from drunken pranks to muggings to sexual assault. The pervasive narrative of Spring-Heeled Jack spanned a century and a continent when, during the German occupation of Czechoslovakia, locals began reporting a dark figure who sprang from shadow alleys to startle citizens before leaping buildings and train carriages. The entity was dubbed Parek, the Springman. In the early days of his existence, Parek was presented as a sinister figure who terrorized commoners. According to some reports, the Czechs were terrified and many refused to work night shifts. Over the years, Parek, like Jack, developed into a vigilante figure who pestered SS troops, attacked Czech collaborators, and saved civilians from the Gestapo, becoming what many call the first and only true Czech superhero. Spring-Heeled Jack also shares many characteristics with other legendary creatures that have appeared across the world. Mothman, a popular humanoid creature of West Virginia, is often described as a tall human-like figure with glowing red eyes and the ability to glide as if leaping across stretches of air. Mothman famously has large wings, but when folded, these wings are characterized as being cloak-like. The Jersey Devil shares Spring-Heeled Jack's ability to leap great distances and is sometimes depicted breathing fire. One witness of the Jersey Devil in 1934 described him as looking like a large kangaroo, running and leaping across a field. In Chinese folklore, the Jiangshi, also known as the hopping vampire, are formidable figures capable of leaping through the air to attack men and devour infants. In Britain, Spring-Heeled Jack has mostly faded to the status of folklore, a bygone relic of Victorian superstition and sensationalized hoax. But Jack seems determined to remind us of the hold he once held over London town. In 1986, a travelling salesman in South Herefordshire claimed to have been slapped on the cheek by a dark entity who passed him on the road, then leapt away in enormous bounds. The salesman described his attacker as having an elongated chin and wearing a black ski suit. In 2005, witnesses described a figure clad all in black wearing a balaclava and cape crossing streets by leaping from one rooftop to the next. And in 2012, a family travelling by taxi in Surrey reported seeing a dark figure dart across the road in front of their vehicle before leaping 15 feet over a roadside bank. Spring-Heeled Jack was born from a mix of terror, rumour, and the tantalising possibility that something beyond human walked the streets. His sharp claws, leaping bounds, and otherworldly appearance mirrored tales told in other corners of the world of shadowy figures that seemed to slip between dimensions, phantom assailants who vanish before the eye can focus, beings who arrive with no clear origin and depart without leaving answers. The pattern is eerily familiar. A figure that defies the laws of nature, delights in sowing chaos, and vanishes into legend before it can be caught. But legends are not dead. Even now, in the modern age of streetlights, CCTV, and mobile phone cameras, there are whispers, claims of a caped figure with burning eyes and an impossible leap. Whether these are echoes of an old fear, a modern trickster imitating the past, or proof that Spring-Heeled Jack was never just a story, no one can say for sure. London in the 1800s wasn't short of mystery or indeed terror. Before Spring-Heeled Jack, those in the capital had to deal with a group known as the London Burkers. In 1832, renowned English philosopher and social reformer Jeremy Bentham died at 84. Instead of being placed in a cemetery plot under a headstone outlining his life's work, Bentham's body was given to physician Tom Southwood Smith to be turned into an auto-icon. Bentham wished for his corpse to be dissected and then preserved for public display. Smith padded Bentham's skeleton with hay, dressed it in Bentham's clothes, and posed it in one of the late philosopher's favourite chairs. Smith attempted to mummify Bentham's head, but the results were shockingly macabre, and in the end, the auto-icon was given a wax head instead, and still sits on public display at University College London's Student Centre today. Bentham's decision to have his body dissected and preserved was mainly driven by his philosophy of utilitarianism, which posits that the most moral action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. His final wishes and the care with which they were executed stood in stark, shocking contrast to the general state of death care in London at a time when groups of resurrectionists or body snatchers were turning to nighttime raids, grave digging, and even murder to keep up with demand for bodies. The most notorious of these sinister profiteers were the London Burkers. The practice of dissecting human corpses has been essential in advancing medical science, but anatomists have faced many obstacles to their work throughout history. Before dissection, knowledge of the human body was limited to philosophical beliefs, like Aristotle's notion that the heart was the seat of intelligence, and Hippocrates' theory that the human body contains 4 humours or fluids whose balance determines health. Roman physicians gathered vital knowledge while treating wounded gladiators, and new dissection could significantly advance their understanding of anatomy. But such treatment of corpses was forbidden. Instead, physicians like Galen turned to animals, especially monkeys, to improve their practice. During the Renaissance period, anatomists and artists performed dissections in secret. During these sessions, a professor read aloud from Galen's work, while a demonstrator attempted to point out the various body parts mentioned to the assembled group. Eventually, the practice became accepted under strict terms, with certified anatomists performing dissections before large crowds of scientific scholars. By the 18th century, new medical schools were appearing all over the world, creating a shortage of bodies unable to meet the high demand for dissections. In 1752, Parliament passed the Murder Act, which allowed medical schools in England to dissect bodies of executed murderers for anatomical education and research. To meet the growing demand, the government also increased the number of crimes for which hanging was a punishment. Even so, there was a significant shortage of corpses as dissection became a major component of training doctors and surgeons. With just a few dozen executions each year, medical schools found themselves woefully short of the roughly 500 bodies needed to maintain educational standards. Instead, they turned to another source: buried bodies. While robbing a grave was a criminal offence, human corpses were not considered property. They could be exhumed and sold without restriction. Organised gangs of men, known as resurrectionists, dug up recently buried bodies or stole bodies before burial, then sold them to anatomy teachers. Unsurprisingly, the general public did not take kindly to their loved ones being prized from their graves and sold for dissection. In addition to protesting the practice, families began employing a variety of methods to deter body snatching, including hiring guards, renting stone slabs to place over graves until the body was suitably decomposed, and constructing iron cages around the graves. As a result, grave robbing became a more difficult and lucrative profession. In Edinburgh, 2 men found another solution to providing bodies. Instead of digging up corpses, they began murdering people and then selling their victims. The duo, known as Burke and Hare, committed at least 16 murders over the course of 10 months in 1828, selling the corpses to Robert Knox, a renowned anatomist at the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. Their crimes were only discovered when a lodger at Hare's house found the body of their final victim and contacted the police. Hare was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony against Burke, who was convicted of murder and hanged. While most would view Burke and Hare's downfall as a deterrent to anatomy murder, a group of men in London instead found inspiration in the story. After years of stealing and selling bodies, the men known as the London Burkers or Bethnal Green Gang turned to murder instead. John Bishop and Thomas Williams were the leaders of the Burkers, but little is known about their lives. Bishop's mother died when he was young, and his father had a moderately successful carting business, but he was hit by a carriage in the road and had to have both legs amputated, then died 2 weeks later, leaving his son in charge of the family business. Bishop was not a good businessman and preferred drinking and cavorting with his stepmother, whom he later married, to keeping the books. Before long, he'd essentially destroyed the carting business and turned to other jobs, including acting as a police informant and giving false evidence in court for people who needed alibis. Eventually, he found his way to body snatching. In July 1830, Bishop rented cottage number 3 in Nova Scotia Garden. Shortly after, Thomas Williams moved in next door. Williams had worked a series of menial labour jobs before deciding crime was an easier path to financial security. While serving jail time for stealing a copper bathtub, he learned how to blow glass and intended to start his own business when he got out. Instead, he moved next door to John Bishop and began helping him steal and sell corpses. The pair were assisted by a wider circle of resurrection men, including a Covent Garden porter named Michael Shields and an unemployed butcher named James May, also known by the charming nicknames Jack Stirabout and Black-Eyed Jack. Body snatching was a seedy business, but it was a booming one. Gangs of snatchers operated with the help of local pubs, where landlords allowed the gangs to store and display their corpses. The London Burkers' pub of choice was the Fortune of War, located near St. Bartholomew's Hospital in Smithfield. There, the Burkers could meet in privacy, plan their next exhumation, and stash their products for sale. Teachers and medical students would browse the available corpses and pay for the ones they wanted, with the pub landlord receiving a cut of the profits for his trouble. In addition to using the services of the Fortune of War, the Burkers also made personal deliveries to hospitals to capitalise on profits. A fresh corpse could fetch as much as 12 guineas, a sum more than a skilled tradesman made in a month. On November the 5th, 1831, Bishop, Williams, May and Shields delivered the fresh corpse of a 14-year-old boy to King's College School of Anatomy. Anatomy demonstrator Richard Partridge examined the body, noticing that it was unusually fresh and bore signs of a violent death. Even more disturbing was that the body showed no signs of ever having been prepared for burial and placed in a coffin. Under the pretense of having a £5 note changed into smaller coins for their payment, Partridge consulted with anatomy professor Herbert Mayo, and the two men decided to inform the police. The Burkers were arrested and held in jail. On November the 8th, a coroner's inquest was held to determine the cause of death of the 14-year-old boy, believed to be an Italian lad named Carlo Ferrari from Piedmont. The jury concluded a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown, adding that they had very strong suspicions in their minds against the prisoners Bishop and Williams. A search of the men's Nova Scotia Gardens homes was launched. While the name Nova Scotia Gardens may call to mind greenery and quaint cottages, this was no picturesque place. Located in Bethnal Green, the gardens had once been a brick field. After the clay had been exhausted, the area was filled in with human waste, and ramshackle sheds were built and rented as cottages to some of London's most wretched inhabitants. At the cottage, police found bits of bone, skin and hair in the garden, and clothing matching the description of an Italian boy seen nearby. They also discovered other personal items in a well and in the privy, indicating that Bishop and Williams may have killed multiple victims. While Michael Shields was ultimately found to be uninvolved in the boy's death and had only been hired to help carry the hamper containing the boy's body, Bishop, Williams and May all stood trial for murder and were found guilty. The men were sentenced to death by hanging. Over the next 2 days, both Bishop and Williams offered detailed confessions of their crimes, which were witnessed and recorded by prison officials. The 14-year-old was not Carlo Ferrari, but a Lincolnshire boy who assisted in driving cattle to market in Smithfield. The men had enticed the boy away from his cattle and taken him to the Fortune of War, where they promised him work and lodgings. The boy accompanied Bishop and Williams back to Nova Scotia Gardens, where they hid him in the privy until their wives and children were asleep. That night, the men drugged the boy with rum laced with laudanum and left him unconscious while they went back out for more drinks. When they returned, they tied a cord around the boy's feet and dunked him in the well, where he drowned. They undressed him, pulled his teeth out, and placed him in a sack. The next evening, they arranged for May and Shields to help them deliver the body to King's College. The pair also admitted to the October 9th murder of Frances Pigburn, a poor woman they'd found sleeping rough in Shoreditch. The men lured Frances back to the cottage, drugged her, and drowned her in the well. Her body was sold to a surgeon named Mr. Granger for 8 guineas. Finally, Bishop and Williams confessed to killing a boy around 10 years old named Cunningham, who they had discovered sleeping in the pig market at Smithfield. They took the boy home and gave him warm beer sweetened with sugar and mixed with rum and laudanum. After drowning him in the well, the men sold the child's corpse to Mr. Smith at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. In addition to the murders, Bishop claimed responsibility for selling between 500 and 1,000 corpses during his 12-year career as a body snatcher. Bishop and Williams' confessions exonerated the other 2 men in their gang of murder. Michael Shields vanished back into London, hopefully having been suitably frightened by the experience to stay well away from criminal activity. James May was sentenced to penal transportation to Tasmania. He died in 1834 and was buried in an unmarked grave on the Isle of the Dead. John Bishop and Thomas Williams were hanged at Newgate in front of a crowd of 30,000 spectators on December 5, 1831. Like their innocent victims, both were subjected to public dissection following their execution. Bizarrely, the police opened up the crime scene in Nova Scotia Gardens to the public for the admission price of 5 shillings, the dreary dwelling eventually being dismantled piece by piece for souvenirs. The London Burkers' heinous crimes sparked renewed outrage over the practice of body snatching and anatomy murder. In 1832, Parliament passed the Anatomy Act, which gave free license to doctors, teachers and medical students to dissect donated bodies, effectively ending the practice of body snatching. The Act also authorised individuals like Jeremy Bentham to donate their own bodies to the cause, setting the groundwork for the anatomical gift programs that continue to provide for medical students and organ recipients today. The legacy of the London Burkers is a chilling one. Progress born from blood. Their crimes forced society to reckon with the horrors it had tolerated in the shadows, and only through their violence did the dead finally gain some measure of peace in the dissection theatres of London. When you look back at the Victorian era, it's easy to see that the Queen was well loved by the general population. However, not everyone was a fan. Before Queen Elizabeth II became the longest reigning British monarch, that honour belonged to another iconic royal, Queen Victoria. Victoria ruled for an astonishing 63 years, from 1837 until 1901. During this period, the British Empire expanded to cover nearly a quarter of the world's landmass and population. She oversaw the rapid advancement of technology and industry that became known as the Industrial Revolution and influenced popular culture by establishing long-lasting trends like white wedding dresses and Christmas trees. To this day, Queen Victoria remains among the most popular monarchs in British history. But that does not mean she didn't have her critics. In fact, she holds the dubious record of being the target of more assassination attempts than any other royal from the United Kingdom. But who were these people that wanted to kill the widely beloved Queen? And why did they wish to murder her? Their stories provide us with a startling insight into the illness, desperation, and anger lurking in Victoria's empire. When the future Queen Victoria was born to the Duke and Duchess of Kent and Strathearn in 1819, she was fifth in line for the throne. Her childhood at Kensington Palace was isolated and controlled by her widowed mother under a strict set of rules known as the Kensington system. These rules included sharing a room with her mother and being chaperoned at all times. After the death of her father and three older uncles, Victoria became queen just weeks after her 18th birthday. Her first request was an hour alone, a rare luxury under the Kensington system. Victoria moved to Buckingham Palace, making it her official residence in London, where she exiled her overbearing mother to distant rooms. The first years of Victoria's reign were rocky, with the public condemning her as too emotional after spreading false pregnancy rumours about one of her ladies-in-waiting. In 1840, she married her first cousin, Prince Albert of the German Duchy Saxe, Coburg and Gotha. Though the marriage was first conceived as a way to legally evict Victoria's mother from Buckingham Palace, Victoria was genuinely love-struck by the handsome and brilliant young Albert. In part because it was the first marriage of a reigning queen in nearly 3 centuries, Victoria and Albert's wedding was a massively popular public spectacle that set trends for modern weddings for royals and commoners alike. Instead of wearing a coloured formal gown that could be repurposed for later occasions, Victoria opted for white cream satin and handmade Honiton lace. And instead of a traditional single-layer fruitcake, Victoria chose a lavishly decorated 3-tier confection weighing 300 pounds. The public's fascination with Victoria's unique and groundbreaking royal ceremony, as well as her passionate relationship with Albert, endeared the masses to their new monarch. With Albert as her new political advisor and companion, Queen Victoria embarked on a mission to make the monarchy a more visible and relevant institution. This included frequent public appearances, which would both cement her reputation as the first media monarch and expose her to the very real dangers of an overpopulated and impoverished London. On June 10th, 1840, a pregnant Victoria and her new husband rode along Constitution Hill in a low, open carriage on their way from a visit to the Duchess of Kent, who had been relocated to Belgrave Square. As the Queen's carriage passed Green Park, a man leaning against a rail raised 2 pistols and fired upon the royal phaeton. Prince Albert later wrote to his brother about the experience, saying, "I saw a most disagreeable-looking man, only 6 paces from us, holding something towards us. Before I could see what it was, a shot cracked out. It was so dreadfully loud that we were both quite stunned. I put my arms around her and asked how she felt, but she only laughed." The man stood there in a theatrical position, a pistol in each hand. It seemed ridiculous. Suddenly, he stooped, put a pistol on his arm, aimed at us, and fired. The bullet must have gone over our heads, judging by the hole made where it hit the garden wall. The would-be assassin was immediately seized by onlookers and taken into custody. He was identified as Edward Oxford, an unemployed 18-year-old from Birmingham. At the time of the attack, he was living with his mother and sister in Camberwell after quitting his job as a potboy in a public house. When authorities searched Oxford's lodgings, they found not only more ammunition and other weapons, but also the written rules and regulations of a made-up martial society he had invented. Though Oxford readily admitted to the assassination attempt, he claimed his pistols were loaded only with gunpowder, not bullets. He was tried at the Old Bailey on July the 9th on charges of treason. The prosecution presented evidence that Oxford had purchased 2 guns and a gunpowder flask a week before the attempted assassination and had practiced with the weapons at several different shooting galleries. Oxford had also purchased 50 copper percussion caps and gunpowder from a former classmate and inquired about where to buy bullets. His defence team argued that his pistols had not been loaded. Indeed, despite extensive searching, no bullets were recovered from the scene. The defence also contended that he was not of sound mind and could not be held criminally responsible for his actions. Various friends and family members testified that he had exhibited signs of mental illness from childhood and that both his grandfather and father were alcoholics with mental health problems. Because at the time both drink and hereditary influence were considered strong factors for insanity, these testimonies were very impactful. The defendant's mother testified that her husband had been violent and that her son was prone to fits of hysterical laughter, emitted strange noises, and had been obsessed with firearms since childhood. In addition, various physicians testified that Oxford was mentally disturbed and that his offence, like that of other imbeciles who set fire to buildings, etc., without motive, except a vague pleasure in mischief, appears unable to conceive anything of future responsibility. At the trial's conclusion, Oxford was declared insane. He spent the next 27 years at Bethlehem Hospital and Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, before being released under the promise to emigrate to Australia and never return to the United Kingdom. In Australia, he changed his name to John Freeman and worked as a decorator before turning his hand to writing, becoming a somewhat prominent journalist in Melbourne. Despite Edward Oxford's brazen attempt to end her life, Victoria was determined to remain steadfastly visible. Following the shooting, she and Albert continued their journey, turning near tragedy into triumph. By the time they returned to Buckingham Palace an hour later, they were met by a cheering crowd. By 1842, the 24-year-old Queen had produced both a daughter and, for the time period, an all-important male heir, while continuing to conduct her rule as publicly as possible. On May the 29th, she and Albert were riding in their carriage near Buckingham Palace when Albert caught sight of what he called a little swarthy, ill-looking rascal. The man aimed a pistol at Victoria as the carriage neared, but the gun failed to fire, and the assailant flared into the crowd. A fearful Prime Minister, Robert Peel, begged the Queen to stay home until the man was captured, but Victoria believed she could hasten an arrest by acting as bait. The following evening, the Queen rode the same route in her carriage. As she had predicted, the gunman was waiting. This time, when he shot at the carriage, plainclothes policemen were ready to seize him. The attacker was John Francis, a teenage carpenter who'd recently embarked on a failed career as a tobacconist. Desperate for cash to support the struggling business, Francis had attempted to rob his roommate, but was caught by the landlord, who threw him out. Soon after, his tobacco shop was closed, and Francis found himself penniless, homeless, and desperate. He used his last 3 shillings to purchase a pistol from a pawnbroker, believing that the notoriety he would receive for killing the Queen would solve his problems. With this in mind, one can only assume he was quite surprised that, after being found guilty of treason, he was sentenced to death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. However, his family wrote to Victoria begging for mercy, and the Queen commuted his sentence to transportation for life. Mere weeks after John Francis' double attack on Queen Victoria, she faced yet another assassination attempt. On July the 3rd, 1842, Victoria's carriage had just departed Buckingham Palace en route to a Sunday church service when a man pushed his way to the front of the crowd and pulled a gun from beneath his coat. He pulled the trigger, but the weapon misfired and was quickly knocked from his hand by a bystander. Then the attacker ran away. This time, though, the police had a clear description of the suspect, who suffered from a spinal deformity and a form of dwarfism. The shooter was 16-year-old John William Bean, whose distinct hunchbacked stature made him easy to find, and he was arrested later that same day at his family's home. He told police that he had never intended to hurt the Queen, since the pistol was filled with only paper and pipe tobacco. Instead, Bean had hoped the stunt would break the harsh pattern of his life. He'd been ridiculed and bullied for years because of his disability and had failed to find work he was physically capable of. As an outcast, Bean had become fascinated by other attempts to assassinate Queen Victoria, and it's believed he may have hoped he, too, would be sentenced to transportation, where a better life may await him in Australia or Tasmania. He was initially charged with high treason, but the charge was reduced to a misdemeanor for assaulting the Queen, both because his weapon was unloaded and to avoid media attention to the assassination attempt, which was the fourth in as many years. After a short trial, a jury found Bean guilty, and he was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. Tragically, the time he spent at Millbank Prison seemed to be the happiest of Bean's life. After his release, he struggled through a few jobs, married twice, and had a son. But he was never able to shake the depression that had compelled him to fire a gun at the Queen, and he was confined to a lunatic asylum at least once. In 1882, he ended his own life with a lethal dose of opium. He left behind a letter to his wife that read, "My whole life has been one of trouble and worry from my very infancy. With my last breath, I think of you, hoping you will do better without me than with me." Bean's assassination attempt prompted the passage of the Treason Act of 1842, which created separate offences for assaulting or alarming the sovereign or having a weapon in the sovereign's presence. These charges carried a maximum sentence of 7 years and provided something of a middle ground for acts of treason that caused no harm, like Bean's, which had gone entirely unnoticed by the Queen. For the next 7 years, Queen Victoria enjoyed a much-deserved respite from treasonous attacks. She and Albert welcomed more children, and following the death of Victoria's mentor, former Prime Minister Lord Melbourne, Albert became the Queen's most influential and trusted advisor. The Irish potato famine, which killed over 1 million and forced another million or more to emigrate, angered many of Victoria's subjects, who felt the Queen did too little to end the suffering. On June 29, 1849, an Irish bricklayer named William Hamilton decided to vent his frustrations in an act of violence. Hamilton, who was raised in an orphanage in Cork, had been forced to emigrate to London at the onset of the famine. The 22-year-old was unemployed and angry about Britain's role in his people's suffering. He stationed himself in Green Park at nearly the same place Edward Oxford had mounted his assassination attempt. On the evening of the official commemoration of her birthday, Victoria passed through the park with 3 of her children, including the future King Edward VII. As their carriage descended Constitution Hill, Hamilton fired his pistol. He was immediately subdued by the head keeper of Green Park and turned over to the police. The pistol had been just as harmless as Bean's, filled only with powder. According to some sources, Hamilton had borrowed a gun from his landlady and intended only to frighten the Queen. Other sources claim that he was hoping to be imprisoned or transported, as he was tired of being unemployed. Because he remained silent at his trial, gave no interviews, and left behind no letters, we may never know his true motive. In the end, he pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of unlawfully discharging a pistol at Her Majesty and was sentenced to 7 years of hard labour on a prison hulk in Gibraltar. After, Hamilton left for Australia, likely working in the lead mines until his death. The Chief Justice who sentenced William Hamilton hoped his harsh punishment would dissuade any more mischief makers from firing powder-filled pistols near the Queen. Unfortunately, Victoria's next attacker simply chose a different weapon, one more personal. On the evening of June the 27th, 1850, Victoria left Cambridge House with 3 of her children and her lady-in-waiting, Viscountess Jocelyn. As their carriage passed through the gates, a well-dressed man stepped forward from the gathered crowd, ran up to the passengers and struck Victoria over the head with a metal-tipped cane. The crowd immediately apprehended the man and seemed prepared to deliver justice themselves when the Queen stood up and proclaimed, "I am not hurt." In truth, this bizarre attack was the closest Victoria had come to an actual assassination. She sported a large bruise and a black eye for weeks and was left with a visible scar. At the police station, the attacker identified himself as Robert Pate, a retired British Army lieutenant. While in service, Pate began to exhibit signs of mental illness and was known as Mad Pate by his fellow officers. He resigned his commission and moved to Piccadilly in 1846, where he lived as an eccentric recluse. He took frequent walks in the royal parks, dressed in dandy clothing. It was during one of these strolls that he took notice of the crowd gathered near Cambridge House and decided, without provocation or motive, to attack the Queen. After the assault, Victoria insisted on following through with her plans to attend the opera that night, telling her ladies-in-waiting, "If I do not go, it will be thought I am seriously hurt and people will be distressed and alarmed." Robert Pate was charged with unlawfully assaulting the Queen with intent to injure, assault with intent to alarm, and intent to break the public peace. At his trial, many witnesses testified that he was of unsound mind. While the court agreed that Pate was mentally ill, they judged him capable of distinguishing between right and wrong, and he was found guilty. Pate's family wealth and social status saved him from the horrors of floating prisons, but he was sentenced to 7 years of penal transportation in Tasmania. Surprisingly, Pate's punishment seemed to have a positive effect on his mental health. After finishing his sentence, he married a wealthy heiress whom he brought home to London after spending 8 years in Hobart. He went on to live a quiet life until he died in 1895, seemingly a fully reformed man. Despite Queen Victoria's outward resolve, the attempted assassinations caused her great anxiety. In her journal, she confessed that when the public pressed close to her carriage, "It always makes me think more than usually of the possibility of an attempt being made on me." But Victoria refused to separate herself from her subject, and over the next decade amassed a long list of accomplishments, including Albert's Great Exhibition, the expansion of her family to 9 children, the first visit by a reigning British monarch to Paris in over 4 centuries, patronage to over 150 institutions, the creation of the highest and most prestigious military decoration, the Victoria Cross, and the granting of Albert's title of Prince Consort. In 1861, Victoria's beloved husband, Prince Albert, died from typhoid fever at the age of 42. The Queen's grief was so immense she withdrew from public life for over a decade, retreating to Windsor Castle and Balmoral. By 1871, Victoria's absence had fueled a growing Republican sentiment, with some radical MPs calling for her removal. Late that year, the Prince of Wales contracted typhoid fever, leaving Victoria terrified that she would lose her son to the same disease that had claimed Albert. When the Prince recovered, he and Victoria attended a celebratory parade through London and a service of thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral. 2 days later, Queen Victoria revived her tradition of a carriage ride through Hyde and Regent's Park to mark Leap Day. As her carriage returned safely through the gates of Buckingham Palace, a man rushed forward and raised a pistol just a foot from the Queen. Victoria bowed her head as her personal servant John Brown tackled the gunman to the ground. 17-year-old Arthur O'Connor, had planned to accost the Queen at gunpoint as she attended the service at St. Paul's, but when that proved impossible, he scaled the fence at Buckingham Palace and hid near the courtyard. O'Connor claimed he had no desire to harm the Queen, but merely to frighten her into signing a document promising the release of Irish political prisoners being held in British jails. O'Connor was charged with unlawfully presenting a pistol to the Queen with intent to alarm her. He pleaded guilty, but presented testimony from his parents and 3 physicians, all of whom claimed the teen was of unsound mind. However, the jury found him sane, and he was sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment and 20 strokes with a birch rod. The Queen requested that instead of the lashing, O'Connor be exiled to Australia. Later, it would be discovered that the jury in the trial had believed their verdict of sanity, which resulted in a short sentence, was kinder than finding O'Connor insane, which would have ensured a lifetime spent in an asylum. Tragically, it seems O'Connor's fate was sealed. Shortly after being exiled, the man began exhibiting more signs of mental illness and would ultimately spend nearly 50 years in a variety of asylums. O'Connor's assassination attempt only proved successful in boosting Victoria's popularity and quashing Republican unrest. In 1877, Victoria became the Empress of India, establishing Britain as the most powerful nation in the world and cementing Victoria's renown. But no amount of public adoration seemed able to protect the Queen from danger. On March 2, 1882, Victoria arrived by train from London to Windsor Station, where she was greeted by a crowd that included a group of students from nearby Eton College. As the Queen left the station yard in her carriage, she heard what she thought was the sound of an explosion from the engine. Seconds later, Victoria saw a man being bashed over the head with umbrellas by some Eton boys before he was wrestled away by a policeman as she was whisked away to the safety of Windsor Castle. The perpetrator of this 8th attempted assassination was a 28-year-old named Roderick Maclean. Maclean came from a respectable family, but after the death of his parents, he was essentially cut off by his siblings, who gave him an increasingly smaller allowance each month. He began wandering the towns of England, living mainly on the streets. He spent time confined in the Wells Lunatic Asylum at Somersetshire before eventually making his way to Portsmouth, where he sold his scarf and concertina to buy a revolver. From there, he walked to Windsor, convinced that his troubles stemmed from a rejection of a poem he'd sent to the Queen. In truth, Victoria had never seen Maclean's work. It had been turned away by one of her ladies-in-waiting. Maclean was also a Republican sympathiser, though it appears clear his assassination attempt had far more to do with personal revenge than a political agenda. He was tried in Reading for high treason, as his weapon, a German revolver, was loaded. He pleaded not guilty, claiming he'd never meant to harm the Queen, only to alarm the public. At trial, a physician testified that Maclean had been found certifiably insane 2 years prior after claiming that all the people in England were conspiring against him and that Maclean believed the only way to stop them was to injure or kill someone. But by this point, the courts were tired of these attempted assassination trials and ready to punish Maclean to the fullest extent. The prosecution successfully argued that the purchase of a revolver and ammunition days before the attempt, combined with writings discovered on Maclean that outlined his intentions, showed clear premeditation. Eventually, he was found not guilty, but insane, ensuring that he'd spend the remainder of his life behind asylum walls. He was committed to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, where he spent the next 39 years before dying of apoplexy at age 67. Following Maclean's trial, Queen Victoria requested that Parliament pass the Trial of Lunatics Act of 1883, which would allow a jury to return a verdict of guilty but insane at the time. This would enable such defendants to be kept in custody as criminal lunatics. Victoria hoped that the change of phrasing from not guilty to guilty of the act or omission charged, but insane so as not to be responsible according to law for his actions, would act as a deterrent to other mentally ill would-be criminals. The act marked a crucial step toward establishing a legal definition of insanity and remained in use until 1964. Maclean's attack was the last assassination attempt Queen Victoria experienced. She appeared to take it in her stride, writing to her daughter, "It is worth being shot at to learn how much one is loved." Victoria ruled for another 19 years before dying, not of a gunshot wound, but after a series of strokes at the age of 81. For nearly 64 years, she had defined an era of British rule and refused to let the many attempts on her life push her away from the public. Throughout her historic reign, Victoria faced assassination attempts in parks, on palace drives, and in public processions, each one a moment where history could have been changed entirely. And yet she survived them all. Most of the attackers were young men, often isolated and deeply mentally unwell, acting not out of political conviction, but from delusion, desperation, or a desire for notoriety. Ironically, rather than undermining her authority, each attempt only strengthened the monarch's grip on the public imagination, with Victoria cast again and again as the brave sovereign who stared down danger with unshakable calm. But behind the scenes, she was not made of stone. In her private letters, Victoria expressed fear, frustration, and even sorrow for some of her would-be assassins. In the end, these attempts say less about Queen Victoria herself and more about the fragile state of the nation that surrounded her, where poverty, mental illness, and a lack of support systems could turn lost souls into dangerous ones. And it raises a troubling question. How many of history's most defining moments have come down to the instability of a single mind and the sheer luck of a missed shot? We flash forward in time for our next story as we explore a selection of dark tales designed to serve as a warning. Whether it's drowning in unexpectedly deep water, losing a limb to a passing train, or being electrocuted while trying to retrieve a toy from a power station, most Brits who grew up in the 1970s or 80s have very specific fears tied to public information films they watched at school or during television commercial breaks at home. For many, the images from these films remain instantly recognizable decades later, cementing their importance in shaping a cultural narrative. Sometimes funny, usually informative, and often controversial. British public information films provide a window into some of the nation's darkest fears. Public safety films weren't conceived to terrify the nation. Their origins can be traced back to World War II, when the newly formed Ministry of Information, or MOI, was tasked with disseminating information to control the narrative of Britain's role in the war. Planning for the MOI began as early as 1935, when the Committee of Imperial Defence noted an increasing concern that another war would create an intense strain on the civilian population. Believing that government propaganda would be needed to maintain morale in the homeland, the committee began brainstorming ways to combine the lessons learned in World War I with new communication technology now available to the masses. Officially set up on September the 4th, 1939, that's the day after Britain declared war, the MOI was tasked with issuing national propaganda, both at home and abroad, as well as censoring any information deemed to be of military value. Their work included distributing pamphlets and posters to local authorities, organizing thousands of public meetings, curating exhibitions, producing films, hosting radio broadcasts, and conducting social surveys. The press and the general public were sceptical of the MOI, and worries about the ministry delaying or censoring information were widespread. This criticism only grew when the MOI's first publicity campaign was poorly received. Even before the Ministry of Information had been officially created, officials drafted a series of 3 posters for public distribution. The first 2 read, "Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory," and "Freedom is in peril. Defend it with all your might." The MOI had intended for the messages to be a general reassurance and a morale booster, but they only drew attention to the disparities between the social classes. The lower classes were immediately asked to make profound sacrifices, while the wealthier classes had yet to feel the true impacts of war. Public reaction was so adverse to the first 2 posters that the third one was held back from public release. The posters were destroyed and largely forgotten until 2001, when a rogue copy of the third poster was discovered at the bottom of a box in a bookshop in Northumberland. The shop owner found the poster quite charming, so he displayed it. "Keep calm and carry on," it read. While not every one of the MOI's efforts was well received, changes in leadership and new approaches to communicating with the public resulted in many successful campaigns. Even today, Make Do and Mend, an MOI initiative that encouraged people to get as much wear as possible out of the clothing they already owned, remains a popular approach to fashion consumption. And slogans like "Careless talk costs lives," or "Dig for victory." They were popular reminders that even small actions could have far-reaching consequences. However, perhaps the most impactful cultural phenomenon they introduced was the public information film, a series of widely distributed videos aimed at educating the general public and boosting morale. These short films were commissioned and produced by the Crown Film Unit and independent production companies and were shown in cinemas, factories and social clubs. Some of these films, such as the aptly named How to Fit a Gas Mask, showed specific practical ways to protect oneself from possible Nazi attacks. Others, like 1941's Ordinary People, which depicted an average day in London where the Blitz affects all social classes, were aimed at creating a sense of national solidarity. Unlike posters or pamphlets, public information films, or PIFs, could impart information in an entertaining way. Drama and comedy shorts starring popular actors were just as culturally relevant as the feature-length films they preceded. The 1940 short All Hands featured well-known actor John Mills playing a sailor whose girlfriend thoughtlessly shares vital wartime secrets, leading to his ship being torpedoed by the Germans. At 11 minutes long, All Hands had the ability to share a heart-wrenching narrative of human loss. However, the MOI commissioned hundreds of very short films that relied on snappier messaging to communicate with audiences. Most PIFs had just around 1 minute to inform, persuade or motivate their audiences. These films mainly relied on memorable slogans or comedy. However, a handful of these PIFs employed jarring and unsettling images to convey their message. In an appeal film for funds following the Japanese invasion of China, audiences were shown heart-rending images of diseased and starving Chinese orphans, exhausted refugees and city streets reduced to rubble. Another PIF, produced by the Ministry of Food, warned of the dangers of vitamin D deficiency by showing footage of children suffering from rickets in the aftermath of World War I. Following Germany's surrender, the Ministry of Information was dissolved in March 1946, and its residual functions were passed to the Central Office of Information. Unlike the Ministry of Information, the COI was not itself a government department, but rather a central agency sponsored by numerous departments to deliver information to the public as a neutral civil service. Although the MOI had been highly criticised throughout the war, it had been undoubtedly effective, and the government saw value in continuing its public information campaigns. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, PIFs aimed to communicate the importance of continued rationing, explain how Attlee's new Labour government was spending taxpayer money, and encourage Brits to remain hopeful during a time of rebuilding and economic uncertainty. Major reforms like the Education Act, the introduction of the welfare state, and the establishment of the National Health Service promised a shield for every man, woman, and child against the ravages of poverty and adversity. Many public information films commissioned during the late 1940s and 1950s aimed to support these new systems by encouraging public health and safety and explaining the positive impacts of new legislation. PIFs introduced recurring characters like Charlie, an animated everyman who is deeply sceptical of new government policies. Richard Massingham, an eccentric actor who began producing and starring in PIFs during the war, was an instantly recognisable comic figure in dozens of punchy films. However, it wasn't all cartoons and comedy. The COI also commissioned films to educate the public about dangers, often through deeply disturbing short films. 1947's Playing with Fire addresses the dangers of leaving small children unsupervised around sources of heat. Over the course of 10 minutes, the audience is shown various fire and burn catastrophes. One child falls into a scalding tub of water. Another trips over the cord of a gas cooking ring and burns his arm, which sizzles loudly. A young girl stands too close to the fireplace and her nightgown catches fire. After each horrific catastrophe, the film cuts to a clip of an ambulance, its sirens wailing, followed by a shot of an empty hospital bed and a bizarre loop of what must have been nightmare fuel for the parents of the time. After sharing various safety measures such as fire guards and directions on how to extinguish flames on clothing, the film ends with a shot that pans slowly up the body of a young girl covered in severe burn scars. 1951's unguarded moment was equally disturbing. The film shows how Johnny, Fred and Mary, all employees at the same factory, take various forms of transportation at the end of their shift, hurrying in their eagerness to get home. Johnny by motorcycle, Fred by public tram, and Mary on a bicycle with an underinflated tyre. Once home, all three workers see reports of their horrific deaths in the newspaper. Their lifeless bodies are shown pinned under cars as a voiceover explained that their foolish, selfish haste had led to preventable deadly accidents. I would bet that the image of Mary's blank staring eyes as she's pulled from under a vehicle haunted many viewers for some time. As Britain's standard of living rose, so did the public's access to public information films. Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953 was watched on television by 20 million citizens, making it the largest mass viewing of a televised event to date. By the early 1960s, having a television was on its way to becoming the norm. The Central Office of Information provided PIFs free of charge to broadcasters to use in television programming. The short films proved useful in filling the gaps in fixed-duration commercial breaks left by unsold advertisement slots. Indeed, they became so commonplace in programming that they were often referred to simply as fillers. The 1960s introduced the newly revealed threat of smoking through PIFs, showing images of gasping elderly men and diseased lung tissue. Public films from this decade also sought to control the narrative of a shrinking British Empire by portraying Britain as a benevolent administrator taking the final steps in stewardship with nations ready to embrace independence. Films like 1961's Nigeria, The Making of a Nation, were a far cry from the realities of British colonialism. Some subject matters did not need scary images or distorted narratives to make an impression. The film In the Shadow of the Wall explains the tensions that led to the construction of the Berlin Wall, tapping into the widespread fear of communism and division during the Cold War. With the end of the national service conscription, military recruitment became a regular part of PIF production, highlighting the new emphasis on training opportunities and more competitive salaries.
What do you have to do to get your £19.53 a week?
This'll tell you all about it.
Find out what the Army's really like. Get this new book, free, from any Army Careers Information Office.
In the 1970s, public information film producers leaned increasingly into horror styling and scare tactics to deliver information, usually with a background of eerie synthetic music and a deep-voiced narrator. Many of these now iconic films have never been forgotten by those who viewed them as children. In 1971, Never Go With Strangers was aired to teach children about the dangers of accepting rides or gifts from strangers. This PIF utilised the familiar theme of villains in disguise, as seen in popular fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood and Hansel and Gretel, to illustrate that wicked people will use tricks to harm others. The film shows several adults attempting to lure children away from public places by offering them a ride or tempting them with promises of treats. In one scene, a young girl named Janet is offered a ride home by a man who tells her they can stop in a field nearby to see a newborn baby donkey. The voiceover tells Janet that if she were to get in his car, the man might take your clothes off. In another scene, a girl named Lucy is shown cowering in fear as the shadow of a large man looms over her. With unsettling music and a pulsing red light used to indicate danger throughout, the film is undeniably disquieting. Never Go With Strangers was so distressing that government officials instructed it only to be shown under responsible adult supervision and did not release it for regular TV airing. Instead, children across the country gathered in school halls to watch the film. Even with controlled viewing, Never Go With Strangers still made a lasting impact, with many Brits naming it the most frightening PIF ever. In a different approach, the COI released a Stranger Danger episode of the popular animated PIF series Charlie Says. In the video, a little boy named Tony and his pet cat Charlie play together at the park when a man in dark clothing appears in the background. The man offers to take Tony to see puppies.
And I said yes.
But Charlie interrupts their conversation and reminds Tony that he's not supposed to go with strangers. Let me interject. This is how Charlie actually spoke. Meow, 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 meow. Though much less frightening than Never Go With Strangers, this animated film still seared the phrase, "Do you want to see some puppies?" into the collective consciousness of a generation. Strangers weren't the only danger British children were warned of through these frightening films. In the 1973 short Lonely Water, a ghoulish robed figure named the Spirit of Dark and Lonely Water lures children to their deaths. The Grim Reaper-like spirit, voiced by Donald Pleasance, announces that he is ready to trap the unwary, the show-off, the fool, while standing above a misty river. In the next scene, the spirit watches as a group of kids gather around a small pool at a construction site. One boy uses a stick to retrieve a ball, but slips into the water, which is much deeper than it appears. The spirit claims another life when a child leans far over a duck pond while holding onto a tree branch he hadn't realized was rotten. The branch gives way, sending the boy tumbling into the pond. In the final scene, the spirit stands by as a child flails and yells for help in the water near a no swimming sign. Other children hear and manage to rescue the drowning child, much to the spirit's annoyance. As the Reaper's black robe sinks below the water, the spirit issues an echoing threat of, I'll Be Back. Lonely Water, voted among Channel 4's 100 Greatest Scary Moments, was commissioned by the Home Secretary following pressure from the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents. While there is no evidence to prove that Lonely Water was responsible for preventing drownings, many people who saw the film as children have shared that it frightened them into avoiding swimming altogether. Another well-known 1970s piff is Children and Disused Fridges, an animated film warning of the dangers of children playing in discarded refrigerators. For decades, household refrigerators were designed to seal shut using a mechanical latch. Production of appliances virtually stopped during World War II, and when it resumed, families eager to upgrade disposed of their old fridges in back gardens, along roadsides or on public lands. As the film points out, these discarded fridges were tempting play spaces for children. The narrator warns, to a child, it's a caravan, a ship, a castle, even a bed, before the fridge slams shut loudly. And the narrator adds, and a death trap. Suffocation inside an abandoned fridge may sound like an urban legend, but it was a fairly widespread problem until the 1980s. Unlike Lonely Water, this film does not blame children's foolishness or unwariness for these accidents, but rather adults who failed to properly dispose of their outdated appliances. Thankfully, it appears many people heeded the film's advice to remove fridge doors, smash their locks, or arrange for proper disposal, as fridge-related deaths declined in the following decade. Most safety films in the 1970s focused on common dangers that all British children might encounter in their daily lives, such as strangers, bodies of water, and fire. But one of the most haunting films of that decade was created for a very specific and small audience. Apaches, a 27-minute film released in 1977, was shown only in a handful of rural areas to illustrate the dangers of playing on farms. Despite its limited release, Apaches quickly became one of the most notorious public information films ever made, a distinction it retains to this day. The film follows a group of 6 children playing a game of cowboys and Indians in their rural village. Kim, Sharon, Michael, Tom, Robert, and the narrator Danny take their game to a local farm where they pretend to be Apache warriors. As they play, the children are killed one by one in various accidents. Seemingly oblivious to the deaths, the remaining friends continue the game until only one child remains. Kim is the first to die after she jumps onto a flatbed being pulled by a tractor. She falls and is run over by the tractor's tire. Next, Tom drowns in a slurry pit after slipping off a muddy fence. Sharon dies from accidentally drinking chemicals during a pretend Apache ceremony. Robert is crushed to death when a heavy cattle gate leaning against a wall is knocked over during their game. Danny pretends to ride a tractor but accidentally disengages the brake and rolls off the road, crashing into a ditch. The film ends with Michael, the only survivor of their farm visit, attending his cousin Danny's funeral. Not only was Apaches graphic in its depiction of the farm deaths, but it was reminiscent of a slasher-style horror film in the way the victims are picked off one by one. The inclusion of adult farm workers who witness the children's deaths and do nothing to stop their game adds to the film's sinister atmosphere. Red herrings like moving vehicles and swinging meat hooks add to the suspense as viewers wait to see how the next child will die. Perhaps it's unsurprising that Apaches was directed by John Mackenzie, whose next project was the classic gangster thriller, The Long Good Friday. Even watching this film now, nearly 5 decades later, still sparks an intense fear of farming accidents for an audience who have absolutely no reason to ever set foot in a barn. The same year that rural children across Britain were subjected to the horrors of Apaches, a public information film produced by British Transport Film, terrified audiences so thoroughly it was banned entirely. The Finishing Line is a 20-minute short film directed by John Kirsch that depicts a typical school sports day with an unnerving twist. A young boy who had recently been warned of the dangers of railway lines by his school headmaster imagines a sports event on a train track. The students are split into teams and made to participate in a series of events that are better suited to Squid Games than a sports day. First, the children must get past the fence to gain access to the railway lines and then run across the tracks. Next, the competitors must throw stones at the passing train to earn points. Extra points are given for hitting a passenger and the driver, who are left badly injured by broken glass. The next event is Last Across, a game of chicken where students must run across the tracks in front of a speeding train. In the chaos that ensues, most of the contestants are hit by the train. After their bodies are carried away on stretchers, the final game, called the Great Tunnel Walk, is announced. The competitors must walk through a 3-mile-long dark tunnel as a train battles towards them from the other end. At the finish line, a cheery band awaits the arrival of the winners, who emerge from the tunnel, bloodied and limping. The film ends with the scene of adults, presumably the children's parents, carrying dozens of lifeless bodies from the tunnel and laying them side by side across the tracks. When the finishing line was shown to children in schools, the backlash was swift and intense. The film was deemed so disturbing that it was shelved immediately and never released on TV. It was only in 2003, 20 years after it was banned, that the finishing line was shown publicly for the first time by the British Film Institute. After the film was deemed too graphic for use, British Transport Films commissioned a new information video to replace it. In 1979, the film Robbie premiered in 3 alternative versions to show that both electrified and non-electrified tracks are dangerous. All 3 tell the story of an adventurous 8-year-old named Robbie who loves football and trains. After the football match, Robbie's older siblings and a friend want to take a shortcut home by crossing a train track. Robbie argues that the tracks are too dangerous, but the other children tease him until he relents. In one version of the film, Robbie's older brother goads him into crossing the tracks by snatching Robbie's football boots and throwing them toward the railway line. The boots get tangled on the overhead electric line. Robbie attempts to remove them with a long metal pole and is electrocuted. In the second version of the film, Robbie's friend falls crossing the tracks and Robbie sets down his boots to help him up. The laces get stuck in the track, and when he pulls them free, he stumbles backward onto another track and is hit by an approaching train. The third version of Robbie shows him accidentally stepping onto the electrified third rail of the track. In each version, Robbie's mother is informed by police that he has been seriously injured and will spend the rest of his life confined to a wheelchair due to electrocution or double foot amputation. Robbie's older sister is admitted to hospital in a catatonic state after witnessing the horrific accident. While Robbie was less graphic than the finishing line, many children were still rightfully terrified by the film. A decade later, a new generation of viewers were treated to their own traumatizing piff on electricity. 1989's Football begins with 3 boys spotting a football inside an electricity plant. One of the older boys slips through a broken part of the fence and climbs to the roof where the ball has landed. But as he starts to throw the football to his friends, he connects with the overhead power cables and is electrocuted in a shower of sparks. The youngest boy rushes to help him, discovering his charred and smoking figure lying on the roof. Just as the third boy shouts at him to be careful, the littlest child bends down to help his friend and touches a metal pylon, electrocuting himself. Other notorious films from the era included Andy Lights the Fire, a fire safety piff that shows a child accidentally setting his home ablaze after carelessly discarding a used match. The Balloon, a 10-minute road safety film featuring a terrifying clown, creepy rhyming language, balloons popping as children are hit by cars after failing to look both ways, and a chilling reminder that if you don't cross the street safely, you might pop. And a series of high-concept special effects films warning of the spread of HIV and AIDS. As Britain entered the 21st century, piffs evolved to include warnings about internet scams, mental health issues, bullying and climate change. Many of these newer films employed the same dark and shocking tactics as older piffs, but the prevalence of violent and graphic content as a whole meant that these films did not have the same cultural impact as their predecessors. In 2009, Gwent Police commissioned a £10,000 piff called Cow to warn teens about the dangers of texting while driving. Director Peter Watkins says his 30-minute film was influenced by 1970s piffs such as Lonely Water and Apaches, as well as modern horror movies. Cow features highly realistic crash footage and shows the deadly aftermath of a multi-vehicle accident caused by texting. The images are deeply disturbing. A child crying as she asks repeatedly why Mummy and Daddy won't wake up. A badly injured teen being airlifted from the crash site. The film's dramatic and graphic nature was well received by audiences, and a 4-minute clip of the crash scene became an international viral hit. Despite the continued success of piffs like Cow, the age of public information films has mostly come to a close. In 2011, the Central Office of Information was closed, marking the end of a 65-year run of government-funded public information films. Although several non-profits and charitable organisations continued to produce public safety films, the days of ad campaigns that became cultural phenomena are largely behind us. In 2020, the British Film Institute released a Blu-ray collection called The Best of COI, 5 decades of public information films, sparking a renewed interest in the harrowing films that once warned Britons about everyday dangers. The role of the Ministry of Information and the Central Office of Information remains a subject of broad debate. Some argue that the wartime propaganda distributed through early piffs placed Britain on a path that veered too closely to the kind of authoritarian overreach the nation was at war to defend against. Others view the work of the MOI as essential in educating and motivating the public during some of Britain's darkest days. Should the work of a propaganda department be continued during times of peace? Some critics believe the creation of the COI and the continuation of public information films in post-war Britain indicate a government that was unwilling to relinquish control over the flow of information to its citizens. However, others argue that COI was largely successful in stimulating a sense of civic responsibility through entertaining films that were, in turn, humorous, stirring, informative, and yes, sometimes terrifying. Whether you see them as essential warnings or unsettling propaganda, there's no denying the lasting power of Britain's public information films. They don't just mirror the fears and values of their time. They helped shape them, embedding themselves into the cultural memory of a generation. Through their eerie atmospheres, stark visuals, and often brutal honesty, these films offer more than just safety advice. They open a window into the nation's psyche at specific points in its history. Today, revisiting these films is like digging up a time capsule filled with anxieties, moral lessons, and the ghosts of past fears. While their production may have ended, their legacy still lingers in parodies, in nightmares, and in the way a whole generation instinctively recoils at the sound of a dark hooded figure whispering from the water's edge, "I'll be back." Our final story is one about a woman who survived against the odds as we delve into the life of Ada Blackjack. There are few places more inhospitable to human life than the Arctic. It's a land of extremes, biting cold, blistering winds, months of darkness followed by days of endless sun. Food sources are limited to what animals you may be able to hunt, assuming you aren't hunted first by polar bears or wolves. Treeless landscapes, blinding sunlight, and blowing snow make navigation nearly impossible. The indigenous peoples of this harsh land relied on knowledge honed over thousands of years, working in tandem with the fragile ecosystem to survive. In the past and today, survival in the Arctic has depended on community. The incredible amount of work required to stay alive is simply too much for a single person to manage. When 23-year-old Ada Blackjack agreed to join an Arctic expedition, she believed she'd be living amongst dozens of Inuit settlers, a team of experienced scientists and explorers. Instead, she found herself utterly alone, stranded on a remote island in the Arctic Sea. Ada Delatuk, born in Spruce Creek, Alaska in 1898, was a native Inupiat whose ancestors had carved out a life in one of the world's harshest climates. But Ada herself had no survival experience, having been raised in a Methodist mission school in Nome, where her Inupiat heritage was systematically erased. Ada found work as a seamstress and married Jack Blackjack, a local dog musher and hunter. Jack was a cruel, abusive man who ultimately abandoned Ada on the Seward Peninsula with their 5-year-old son, Bennett. After walking the 40 miles back to Nome, Bennett developed tuberculosis and required around-the-clock care. Ada was forced to place her son in an orphanage where he would receive medical care while she attempted to earn enough money to secure their future together. Described as poker-faced, Ada stood less than 5 feet tall and had a penchant for dark blue suits, which she often purchased from the children's clothing section. She was private and shy, but charming and kind to those she was close to. In 1921, the Nome chief of police told Ada he'd heard of an Arctic expedition in need of an Inuit seamstress. She recognized the name of the explorer heading the expedition immediately. Vilhjalmur Stephenson was a well-known explorer, and Ada's younger sister was married to a man who'd worked for him on a previous expedition. Stephenson had spent many years successfully exploring the Arctic coasts of North America, but his 1913 expedition to the Perry Archipelago ended in disaster when his ship, the Karluk, became trapped in ice and most of the crew perished. Stephenson's newest venture aimed to colonize Wrangel Island, a desolate outpost located 140 kilometers or 87 miles off the Siberian coast. Despite his own near-death experience, Stephenson continued to insist that the Arctic was an ideal home, famously saying, "Given a healthy body and a cheerful disposition, a family can now live at the North Pole as comfortably as it can in Hawaii." Ironically, Stephenson had no plans to be among the settlers at Wrangel Island. Instead, he recruited 4 men to lead a group of Inuit families to the island, establish a settlement there, and raise a British flag to claim the territory. The team consisted of Alan Crawford, a 20-year-old from the University of Toronto, 27-year-old American Lorne Knight, 19-year-old Milton Gall, and 28-year-old Fred Mauer. Only Knight and Mauer had previous experience in the Arctic, but Stephenson's list of recruitment criteria prioritized physical attributes over experience, calling for men just out of college, moderately good health, good walker, good circulation, and above average eyesight. The crew was sworn to secrecy and sent to Nome to hire a ship and captain, a sled, and a team of 7 dogs, and to recruit Inuit families to join them. Ada was deathly afraid of polar bears and hated the idea of being so far away from her son, but the expedition offered a salary of $50 a month, far more than she could hope to earn in Nome. She agreed to meet with Alan Crawford, who assured her that her role would be limited to sewing and mending. Unlike the Inuit families who would live on Wrangel Island, she was only expected to stay until spring, when Stefansson would arrive with a relief ship to restock the settlement. In less than a year, Ada would earn enough money to move Bennett to Seattle and build a comfortable life for the 2 of them. She agreed to report to the Silver Wave on September the 9th, when the ship would set sail for Wrangel Island. Ada almost changed her mind when she discovered upon boarding that no other Inuit people had agreed to join the expedition, telling Crawford it was too risky, no matter the reward. Crawford assured Ada they would find willing colonists in Siberia when they stopped to purchase supplies. But again, no matter the fame or fortune Crawford promised, not a single Inuit wanted to go to Wrangel. And so 23-year-old Ada found herself sailing across the Arctic Sea with 4 young, inexperienced men and a cat named Victoria. On September the 16th, 1921, Alan Crawford raised the British flag on a small hilltop as the Silver Wave disappeared from view, headed back to Nome. The men set up camp on a small sand pit on the coast. They framed a rough house out of driftwood against a steep hill, planning to cover it with snow blocks when winter arrived. A floor was fashioned out of split logs and the roof was padded with sod. Inside this crude dwelling they erected a large tent for their living quarters. The men would sleep on one side, while Ada slept in the makeshift kitchen on the other side. 2 small wood-burning stoves were placed at each end to provide warmth. As the explorers began to unpack their crates of supplies, they discovered many of the items they'd ordered were missing or useless. The potatoes were rotten, and the prunes were full of maggots. Even the sled dogs they'd purchased were in terrible condition, already scrawny and sick-looking. The men seemed undaunted by the challenges posed by their meagre supplies and immediately began exploring the island. None of them had much hunting experience, but they managed to kill a polar bear after many failed attempts. To Ada's horror, the island was teeming with the creatures, home to the world's highest density of polar bear dens. Each time she left the safety of her tent, Ada could see polar bears in every direction she looked. At first, she managed to keep her spirits high by focusing on the domestic tasks at camp, while imagining the pile of money that awaited her next spring. But as the snow began to fall and the temperatures plummeted, Ada became terribly depressed. She abandoned her chores and moved into a separate snow house, refusing to speak to anyone but Crawford. From expedition journals, we know that the 4 men were deeply concerned about Ada and tried to comfort and care for her. When that failed, they tried punishing her. Sometimes their efforts would perk Ada up for a few days, but she remained unpredictable and difficult. When she nearly froze to death attempting to run away, the men decided to take drastic measures. They split into 2 camps, 15 miles apart, and took turns staying with Ada. They were no longer gentle and forced her to walk between the camps alone at night, tied her to a flagpole for hours at a time, and threatened to whip her. From their perspective, Ada was a terrible burden on the expedition. Not only was she consuming their meagre rations while contributing nothing in return, but her repeated attempts to run away put them all in danger, forcing them to spend hours tracking her down. In addition to being terribly homesick and frustrated by the reality of finding herself alone in a miserable camp with 4 men, Ada was likely suffering from piblopto, or Arctic hysteria. The syndrome, which primarily affects Inuit women, develops in people trapped in a cold climate with endless days or endless nights. People with Arctic hysteria become paranoid, act irrationally, and are prone to escape attempts in search of relief. When the polar night gave way to short days, Ada began to recover. She returned to work, and the expedition moved back to a single camp. The men and Ada were quick to forgive each other and fell into an easy friendship. By the time the snow melted in May, their spirits were high, but their larder was nearly empty. A relief ship was due to arrive in June or July to bring fresh supplies and settlers and to take home any expedition members who wished to leave. By the end of August, no ship had arrived, and ice was already forming offshore. Unbeknownst to the expedition team, Stefansson had mounted the mission without securing government support or funds for a relief ship. By the time he was able to hire a ship and captain, the pack ice had closed in and the schooner was forced to turn around. The families of the crew members were furious with Stefansson, but he seemed remarkably nonplussed. He wrote to Crawford's family, "There is no more need to worry about them than if they were in some European city or an ordinary place and were merely not in the habit of communicating with you." In reality, the situation on Wrangel Island was growing desperate. They were surviving mostly on walrus skin and hard bread, and Knight had developed chronic stiffness in his back and an aching hip due to scurvy. It was decided that Knight and Crawford would cross the ice for help, reaching Nome in about 70 days. After seeking medical treatment and pressuring Stefansson for help, they would return with food and supplies. 10 days after Ada, Gall and Mauer saw them off, Crawford and Knight returned to camp defeated. Their sled had been too heavy for the malnourished dogs to pull, and Knight's health had deteriorated rapidly. Crawford's feet and fingers were frostbitten, and both of their faces were black and blistered. As terrible as their attempted journey had been, Crawford knew waiting for a relief ship was no longer an option. There were not enough supplies at camp to sustain the 5 of them through the winter. They decided to try crossing the ice again, this time with the 3 healthiest men, Crawford, Mauer, and Gall, going so they could make camp at night more quickly, reducing the time spent in the elements. Ada and Knight would remain behind, awaiting their return with a ship in the summer or fall. Alone with the desperately ill Knight, Ada found herself responsible for all the tasks usually shared by a team of 5. She chopped firewood, checked the traps, and melted snow for water. She succeeded in trapping a fox and hoped the fresh meat would improve Knight's scurvy. But nothing seemed to help. Knight began losing his teeth and could no longer sit up. He was overcome by a craving for fresh raw meat and grew frustrated with Ada's inability to hunt. He turned cruel in his sickness, calling her lazy, stupid, and thoughtless. Ada, who was beginning to experience symptoms of scurvy herself, continued caring for him, determined to keep them both alive until summer. She perfected her trapping techniques and taught herself how to kill foxes by sneaking up behind them, bashing them over the head and breaking their necks. She practiced shooting Knight's rifle and built a skin boat to hunt for walruses and seals. And since Knight no longer had the strength to write in his journal, Ada began keeping a record of their days. For months, she nursed the ill man, who continued to grow sicker. She cushioned his joints with pillows, modified his sleeping bag to allow him to use a bedpan, washed his body, and fed him the best cuts of meat. In return, Knight berated her, praising her husband for abandoning her and saying she was unable to care for her son. Still, Ada prayed that Knight would survive. A cruel companion was better than being alone. On June the 22nd, 1923, Ada checked on Knight before bed. He thanked her for all she had done for him and told her she must be strong to survive until the ship arrived. The next day, Knight died. Unable to face the task of removing his body, Ada built a wall of boxes around his bunk and moved into one of the tents they used for storage. Even though she dreaded being alone, Ada had become a skilled survivalist. She'd learned to hunt seals, had added new soles to her shoes, made herself a parka from reindeer skin and wolf fur, and fashioned a pair of deerskin leggings. Though she still hoped for a ship, Ada had begun preparing for another winter on Wrangel, certain that with her newfound talent, she could keep herself alive. Stefansson, who had decided to retire from exploring, hadn't wanted to admit that the expedition had likely failed. He'd wasted valuable time asking for funding for a relief ship to resupply the crew instead of pleading for a humanitarian rescue. He finally secured financing for a ship in August, already late in the season. After several close calls with icebergs that nearly made him turn back, Captain Noyce reached Wrangel Island on August the 18th. His crew spent 2 days searching the shoreline and continually blowing the ship's whistle before they finally spotted a small figure standing on the beach, arms outstretched. It was Ada Blackjack. She'd survived 2 years on Wrangel Island, 8 months of which she spent entirely alone. Captain Noyce and his crew helped Ada bury Lorne Knight, marking his grave with a wooden cross. A relief crew who had shockingly agreed to stay on Wrangel unloaded 2 years' worth of fresh supplies and began building a new camp. Ada collected her expedition party's belongings, took a final look at Wrangel Island, and boarded Captain Noyce's ship. She learned that Crawford, Mauer, and Gall had never reached Nome. When she reached home, Ada departed the ship with Victoria the cat, the only other surviving member of the expedition. Ada's family was overjoyed at her return. The entire expedition had been reported dead months ago, and they had no hope of ever seeing her again. She was hailed as a hero in Nome, but struggled to readjust to her life there. She couldn't seem to get warm and was constantly hungry. In the fall, she moved with Bennett to Seattle, hoping to get him proper medical treatment and live anonymously. She paid a visit to Knight's family, passing along the few belongings he'd left behind. Knight's parents grew so fond of Ada that they invited her and Bennett to live with them, but Ada wanted to put the memories of Wrangel Island behind her. She gave only one interview to the Los Angeles Times to refute reports that she'd starved Lorne Knight to keep herself alive. Captain Noyce sold excerpts from the expedition journals he'd collected from the camp on Wrangel, and Stefansson published a book about the expedition in 1925 in an attempt to restore his reputation. Though full of inaccuracies, after all, he'd never set foot on the island, Stefansson's account confirmed that Ada's survival was nothing short of heroic. Still, his words did little to improve Ada's life. Stefansson refused to share the profits he'd earned from using her story. Ada had another son and eventually returned to Nome, where she fell ill and nearly died from tuberculosis. She was forced to place both of her boys in the orphanage while she recovered and sold off her home to pay her medical debts. She relocated several times, herding reindeer and trapping along the west coast of Alaska to earn a living. She owned few possessions, the most treasured of which was Knight's Bible, which he'd given to her just before he died. Ada passed away in 1983 at a nursing home in Palmer, Alaska. She was 85. Following her death, her son, Billy, petitioned the state of Alaska to honor her as a native heroine. The state issued a citation that read in part, "From her story, we can each gain an insight into the life and personal courage of a resident of our state who survived under unbearable circumstances, only to be forgotten by her friends and neighbours. It is our duty and obligation to honour Ada Blackjack for her astounding courage, her spiritual strength, and her commitment to her fellow man. Despite Stefansson's best attempts, Wrangel Island was never colonised. The relief crew was removed by the Soviets in 1924, and today the island is a natural sanctuary and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. During the summer months, specially permitted ships bring tourists to the island. The visitors are warned to stay close together and never lose sight of their guide. After all, surviving alone in such an unforgiving place, even on a summer's day, is something few people could do. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.